Greetings and welcome to another installment of Actor Training in the 21st Century. Again, I'm Peter Zazali. It's a global perspective, and I'm delighted to be joined this evening here in Singapore, across town, as it were, with T. Sasitharan. Sasi, if I may, welcome.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's an honor to have you here, Sasi. And just to give our viewers a little bit of your background, you have been working in the Singaporean theater community for over 40 years. You're a pioneer as such, one of the great leaders of Singaporean theater. But in addition to that, you've got a wonderfully varied background. You were a professor, you taught at National University of Singapore, and you taught philosophy there. Yeah. And in addition to that, you were an arts critic, as well as a visual arts critic, as well as a theater critic for the Straits Times, the major English-speaking theater, or the English language newspaper, I should say, here in Singapore. You're artistic director of Substation, a performance venue here. And most importantly, for the purposes of our conversation, you've been a leader in theater training, specifically for performer training at the Intercultural Theater Institute here in Singapore, and you're the co-founder of it. And most recently, along with Anirudhna Kapoor and the late Philip Cirilli, you co-edited a wonderful book entitled Intercultural Acting and Performer Training. I'm just going to hold it up here for our viewers to see. I really have had a chance to look through it. I've cited it in my own work. It's excellent work, and it's excellent to have you here. Sasi, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah.
So, if you could just offer our listeners, our viewers, a little bit of the background of ITI. What brought you to found it, or to co-found it, I should say?
Sure. I think if you understand contemporary theater practice in Singapore, you will understand that it is a practice that's really fundamentally based on a number of tensions. Tensions relating to identity, ethnic identity, cultural identities, tensions relating to national identity, and post-coloniality. So, you know, I'm actually part of what they call the Merdeka generation. It was when Singapore became independent in 1965. And theater in Singapore at that time was a combination of traditional practices, usually Asian traditional practices, you know, things like Chinese street opera, ritualistic Indian theater, theater that was English theater, that was colonial theater, essentially. And so it was this melange of elements, you know, which was considered part of the theater practice in Singapore. And this was contemporary practice. And there was a yearning almost to look out to London and to New York and to European theater as a touchstone for our own practice as actors, as directors, as writers. And this was constantly reflected in the playwriting scene, in the acting scene, in the adaptations that directors would make of Western plays for local audiences, who, you must understand, were increasingly becoming more and more literate in the English language. And vernacular languages and mother tongue, as it's called, began to move into the background. Although Singapore has got 4 official languages, English is the lingua franca. So inevitably, after independence, the English language theater scene assumed a prominence, a kind of prominence in the practice in Singapore. But with that assumption of English language came also the assumption that Western theater practice was somehow dominant in making theater. Now, this was the case for a very long time. But as English language theater existed in Singapore, it coexisted with Chinese theater, with Indian theater, with Malay theater, just on the level of language. And of course, traditional theaters from Indonesia, from India, from China were also present. And they were a fading presence, of course. So the question then became, after about 20 years of working in theater in Singapore, the question became, how do we formalize contemporary theater practice as it is understood in Singapore? How do we formalize contemporary acting practice as it is understood in Singapore? I remember very clearly being at a workshop. I used to attend workshops as a teenager because that's the only access we had to training for acting. And this was a workshop. Usually the workshops were conducted by the wives of colonial servicemen, British servicemen or airmen, and whose wives had time on their hands and they could run workshops. And in one particular discussion, I remember this lady telling me that that actors didn't exist in Southeast Asia. Acting didn't exist in Southeast Asia, and that if you wanted to be an actor, you'd have to go to London or you'd have to go to New York and be accredited in those traditions of acting. And she mentioned this thing called the equity card, which is something that English actors get after they've gone through drama school in London, and which basically enables them to work on stage. And of course, what that sort of Western ideology does is that it completely erases traditions of acting that were part of our culture and part of our practice for hundreds of years. And so there is this inherent conflict. And so when I met Pao Kun, and I met Pao Kun in the 80s, in the 1980s, almost 15 years before we established ITI together. This became something that we had always talked about. We wanted to find out, as it were, what could we possibly present as a curriculum for contemporary acting training from Singapore. And the more we began to research Western theater training and Western actor training methodologies from Stanislavski, Grotowski, post-Stanislavskian systems, including Grotowski. We look at Artaud. We looked at all of these. We looked at Brecht, for instance. All of these major canonical writers and dramatists in the West, underlying what they saw as theater invariably was some element of Asian theater. There was, with Artaud, for instance, there was this fascination with Balinese dance. With Grotowski, there was a fascination with Kathakali. As you know, Brecht was deeply influenced by Beijing opera. The whole idea of the alienation effect was a result of him actually witnessing a Beijing opera performance at a dinner event. So we found that buried within the Western canon of theater and acting was Asian tradition. So I felt it was our responsibility to recover that, not so much as a kind of act of triumphalism or a kind of, East versus West conflict situation, but simply to understand what the roots of a global theater tradition might look like if we then went back to Asian traditions. So that was the founding impulse, as it were, and we realized that Western canonical practices in theater had to coexist with Asian practice. And this is what is the fundamental founding principle of ITI.
That's wonderful.
So ITI is not about Asian theater. ITI is finding a balance in global theater in a post-colonial moment after the colonizers have retreated.
Well, that's beautifully put. Thank you. And again, for our listeners, Pao Kun, your co-founder and colleague of ITI, was a Singaporean playwright, as well as a theater director and I believe a political activist as well, if I'm not mistaken.
His theater was political, but he wasn't a political activist. He was detained for almost 6 years in the 1970s for his theater, which of course had made political comments, but he was never a politician or a political activist. He always saw himself as an artist.
First and foremost, thank you for that distinction. So, Palkun, you talked about this need for a balance, and interculturalism sort of being the weighted term that tethers that
Yes.
balance between, shall we say, Asian practices and Western practices. Of course, binaries are inherently reductive. I'm sure you didn't consider it as a binary nor inferior practice. So how would you define interculturalism and its manifestation in the training at ITI?
Sure. That's a very good question. I think, the term interculturalism has existed in theater for almost 40 years. It's not something new. It's not something we invented. But originally, when it was used, interculturalism was short form, or shorthand, as it were, for internationalism. It simply meant, there was a group or a company of international artists coming together to work on a project. Usually, in the beginning it was used just as that, but later on, I think interculturalism emerged as a coinage with its own legitimacy in order to distinguish between internationalism, multiculturalism. The point about interculturalism, implicit in interculturalism, is the imperative that we accept the tension of differences in culture, in practice, in disciplines. Particularly the tensions that might exist between one culture and another culture of an actor working together in a theatrical context. But this implicit tension is used to create something which is creative, which is new, which is original. I think that there's a difference between multiculturalism and interculturalism, in the sense that the multicultural tends to be segregated juxtaposition of different cultures. The intercultural is segregated juxtaposition of interculturals which are seeking to penetrate one another, which are seeking to engage one another, which are involved in an interactive activity in order to create work. Now, I want to make something very clear from the beginning. I've never proposed the intercultural element in practice as a kind of a political model. It's not. It's strictly an aesthetic dimension, where actors who are working in different languages, working in different disciplines, coming from different practices of training, can engage one another by first and foremost recognizing the difference of the other, and then working towards bridging that difference in a work, which is original, could be a synthesis, which could be a critique, which could be a tangential to both cultures, of the actors. So I think that, as you say, it is a weighted term, but it's a useful term for us to use, because we want to distinguish it from internationalism in theater and multiculturalism in theater.
And as you explore, your colleagues, you and your students explore the two strains, the two streams, if you will, the two different forms that are culturally distinct, that are perhaps nationally distinct as well, and aesthetically distinct. How does that exploration, that weaving, if you will, to borrow from Erica Fischer-Lichte and others,
Yes.
This idea of weaving two separate cultural / artistic identities, two forms, what does that look like in the studio? Like, how does it become specifically present in your curriculum and your student learning outcomes and those sorts of things?
I think that this interweaving, as you call it, as Richter called it, manifests itself in a number of dimensions. First and foremost, personally, for the actor, it manifests itself as a deep sense of discomfort. The actor student is taken out of the comfort zone of his or her culture, or his or her language, his or her practice, and moved into a neutral space where he or she has to encounter the other, to embody this difference in themselves. Now, what it immediately creates is this deep sense of discomfort. But the important thing is to create a safe, neutral environment, a safe, neutral space in the studio where differences are respected and where the protocols of engagement are made clear. So, we have sessions where students talk about their identities, the notion of cultural identity, the formation of their identity as a person, the formation of their self as an actor. And these exchanges happen almost as a kind of are foregrounded. And students come to understand each other, their classmates' practices, their histories, their biographies, most importantly, ideologies that have shaped their work and themselves. And it is from there that we move to a context where, first of all, they encounter forms, traditional theater forms, and they encounter the formality of theater making. And these encounters with traditional theater we call immersions. The students are literally immersed into a distinctly different otherness, which they are committed to learning, understanding, but most importantly, experiencing. And then working through a process where this experience is used as a foundation to create their own work, their own original creation. This is an ongoing thing in ITI. The moment an ITI student comes into school, we tell him, you have to start thinking about creating one work which is original, which you will write or make for yourself, and which you will finally show in the third year. And this is called the individual project.
And the forms become the methodology for achieving that outcome, where the student
Absolutely,
identifies
yeah.
artistic voice, which becomes represented through this piece that they create, that they originate.
Yes.
Wonderful. So in our final segment of the conversation, Sasi, looking towards the future for ITI, and by extension these transferences of cultural forms, aesthetics, identities, the old and new, Asian and Western, shall we say, so to disrupt the binary and find ways where they can indeed intersect and become mutually empowering as a work of art, as a teaching tool as well. What does the future look like? And they want to just end my question with a quote of yours from the book, Intercultural Performance from Theater, Intercultural Acting and Performer Training. You say nothing can live and grow in isolation. I just want to reiterate that. Nothing can live and grow in isolation. And it seems a particularly telling point, given the fact that most of us, in fact, are living in isolation right now in the age of this pandemic. So what does the future look like for ITI and the wonderful concept behind its work?
Yeah, it's interesting, Peter, that you mentioned this, because I remember just before the walls came up, the COVID-19 walls came up, and trans-border travel became impossible. One of our students wrote to me, and she was in transit back to France because she had to get back to France before the quarantines came into place. And she said that the walls are coming up all around the world, and when I think back on my time in ITI, it feels like a dream. I think ITI was premised on the possibility of an eternal intersection and an interaction of difference, in the possibility that these, as you say, these interactions of otherness would emerge in their own time through a process which is unique to each student in something which is valuable and empowering to all sides involved in that interaction. Now, there was a time when I thought that this was the obvious way that the world had to go, that globalization and the intersection of culture and capital and people and ideas was inevitable. And this had to be how we needed to look towards the future and how we need to think about creating a responsible, ethical theater practice, which is, completely open in its understanding of ideologies and ideological differences and culture and cultural differences. But, since COVID-19 and the kind of walls that have been erected for our own safety, because we are facing an existential crisis as a species, and before that, the hint of climate catastrophe and the way we are working in theater, which to me is extremely wasteful, extremely redundant sometimes. The theater practice, particularly of large national companies, it forced me to think about the interactions that happens between a small group of actors in a studio who are making work for small audiences, sometimes intimate audiences. So it's a scaling back, I think, that we need to do. In ITI, that's what we're trying to do. The practice, the process, the methodologies, I think, are sound. But what we need to do is to find an equitable scale for this kind of work to happen, so that we can no longer believe in the that the distance is dead philosophy, where we can take a plane and within a few hours be in another country and continue working. All of that is going to not happen, at least not in the immediate future, unless a vaccine is found. But even if a vaccine is found, I think we need to think more clearly about how we can work efficiently, how we can work more intimately, and how we can work in a scale which is ultimately commensurate with the needs of the world. That's what I'm thinking about the future. Yeah.
Wow. That's a powerful statement from a powerful man, if I may say so, Sasi.
Thank you. No, Peter, you're too kind. Yeah.
Thank you for the conversation. It was a rich conversation. And I wish you and your students and colleagues all the best. Please stay safe, and look forward to coming out the other end of this virus and achieving some of the things you've just so eloquently described.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. It was a pleasure and a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sasi.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye now.